All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. My name is Dhyan, and today I'll be talking about how do we enforce Power BI best practices with Azure DevOps. So my name is Dhyanendra Singh Rathore. I live in Stockholm in Sweden. I work as a Power BI tech lead at Autoliv. I'm a speaker and I'm a blogger. So I write blogs about Power BI, Power Platform, now Fabric, and I speak in community events. So you can find me on LinkedIn as Dhyans. And I also run my own blog, bits2bi.com. That's where you can find all of my sessions. And even today's session, I will write a blog about it. It's not ready right now. It's in progress. So you could find it maybe tomorrow or in a day or so. So in today's session, it's a brief agenda. So first I'll walk you through what are the best practices, then a bit about what happens to best practices today. What is the current status? Then how can we enforce best practices with Azure DevOps? I just got a text that somebody can't hear me. Is that the case for everyone or it's just individual issue? All right, getting back. So after looking at how do we enforce Power BI best practices with Azure DevOps, I'll give you a quick demo to walk you through the steps. How can you set it up for your own Power BI solution or use case? Then we'll talk about a couple of benefits and some limitations. In the end, I'll take all the questions that you put it into the chat. All right, so what are best practices? So if I don't go by the definition, you can read it here. So best practices is like, take it as there are multiple ways of doing something, right? Let's say you want to go buy bread or you want to go to a dairy and buy the milk. So there are different ways you can do that. There could be different routes you could take. There are different modes of transportation you can take, but there is maybe just one or maybe multiple optimal ways of doing it. It could be that gives you the most efficient performance. Maybe it's the cheapest mode of doing the particular things, and those are called best practices, and they changes from field to field. So if you talk about data engineering, you have a different best practice. If you talk about Power BI development, you have a totally different best practice. And other than that, another important factor about best practices, they are adjustable, they are customizable. So if you're working in one team that's dealing with direct query, you might implement a standard best practice in a different way compared to your colleagues who's using an import mode data model, right? Because they has to be customizable. They have to fit your use case. And if they are not, then they are kind of like a rigid practice. And that's something what we want to get away from. The purpose of best practice is to give you the optimal result in that certain situation, right? So how are best practices formed? So usually they are formed based on research or some experience or some lessons that you have learned the hard way, the easy way, and maybe you fail multiple times, maybe you succeed multiple times. So a best practice is something that's the summary or the conclusion of a trial or an attempt or lessons learned or research or experience that you have been through. And in the end, you formed a best practice. So it was a practice, and then you come to the conclusion that it's the best practice. So let's take a simple example so I can demonstrate it in a better way, right? So we start with a simple measure or a simple calculation requirement. In almost all of our data models or calculations or reports, we have this simple formula, right? So we want to calculate the sales margin percentage. The formula is simple. In English, you just take the sales that you have, then you take your costs, you subtract them, and then you divide it by sales and multiply by 100. And then you end up at your sales margin percentage. That's a simple explanation. How do you calculate sales margin percentage? Now let's look at it. If you try to implement this formula in Power BI, how do you write it in the DAX? So the first and straightforward DAX measure is you have margin percentage equal to margin. So your sales amount minus cost is the margin, the difference between sales and cost. So you have one DAX measure that gives you the margin. And then you have another DAX measure that gives you the sales. So in the simplest form, the calculate sales margin can be written as the formula that we see here, the DAX one. Now, this formula works, but it has one problem, right? So when we design Power BI reports and we write DAX measure, we try to make them so some user who's filtering the report, maybe by a country, maybe by a geography, or maybe by a product, the formula should work seamlessly in all of them, in all of those cases, and all of those filtering situations. What happens here? The basic fundamental problem here is if your sales becomes zero, the user gets an error. They see divide by zero error. So even though this DAX measure works, it doesn't work in all the cases. So we can change that, right? And there are different ways of rewriting this to fix the issue, the divide by zero error. Now let's look at a couple of more iterations of the same formula. The first, maybe the most straightforward, or that would come to if you're starting out Power BI as a fresh developer, that might come to you is, how about I check that if my sales number is greater than zero, only then I perform the division operator. And if it's not greater than zero, maybe it's negative or it's missing or it's zero itself, then I return a blank. Now this formula works, right? It doesn't give any error to the user. It works as expected. So this is an acceptable solution. Let's look at another version of the same formula. How can we rewrite this one? So by using another function called if error index, and what does if error does? It checks your first argument. Here, if error executes margin and sales. And if the execution of this formula returns an error, the Power BI DAX engine instant returns a blank. So effectively, this one also returns the expected result. So if you have zero sales, it's gonna give you a blank. So this one also works. Let's look at the third iteration that we have. So in index, we have a function called divide. It's simple. You just put the same two DAX measures, margin and sales, in the divide DAX function. And the blank here, this is optional. So this italics is optional. So even if you miss them out, Power BI is gonna behave in the same way. So what this one does, divide, when you use the divide function here, you're not specifying that I want to check if sales is greater than zero. You are not telling Power BI what I want you to do, the engine to do, when if there says divide by zero or any other error. We're not specifying it. So if we look at it, we have seen one formula and the 4 iterations of it, right? Let's give them a number. And now we want to see which of them is the best practice, right? So one of them, so we have 4 options. We could all use 4 in different use cases, but we want to come to how the best practices are formed. So if you think about from the perspective of error or the situations or the use cases covered, the first one doesn't cover divide by zero. The second, third, and fourth, they cover the divide by zero error. Then how do we choose which one is the best DAX measure to be used in division operations? So one simple answer to this question is, let's look at the execution time, right? Let's try to evaluate it and see how much time does each of them take when you try to execute it against a data model, because that would give you the performance factual numbers for each of these DAX measures. So I'm going to show you average execution time in milliseconds. And to do that, I downloaded the latest Power BI data models created by SQL BI guys. So you can download different models with the latest data. And I executed the same DAX measure equivalent in all the data sets that I'm going to show. And then I took an average of run times just to show like what is the average execution time in milliseconds. So if you execute the formula like option number 1, 2, 3, and 4 in a data set with 2 million rows, these are the execution time we get. So the first one gives us 61, second and third gives us 76 milliseconds and 89 milliseconds. And the last one gives us 65 milliseconds. Now, if I execute the same DAX measures in a bit more heavy data set, so I'm changing it to 21 million rows. Now here, if you look at the performance of option 1 and 4 remains almost the same, just 1 millisecond, doesn't really matter to that much. And same with option number 2 or 3, you have just 1 millisecond difference. So if you go by performance, you can evidently see that either you should use the expression 1 or you should use the expression 4. So they have a tie in terms of execution. But if you consider the use cases covered, the error handling part of it, the clear winner is option 4. You don't have to write any additional checks, and you can be rest assured that your divide will work disregarding whether sales is zero or not. Power BI itself takes care of it. So this gave us one of our best practices right now. And that's how the best practices are formed across different areas of Power BI, whether it's model or whether it's a report, and then they can be categorized into different categories. We'll take a look at that soon. So that brings us to an important question. Why are they important, right? Why are best practices important? So a couple of things that we just checked, right? They enhances our quality. So if I don't use the divide function and directly just use the divide operator, I get into a situation that my outcome is sometimes it shows an error to users, sometimes it shows the correct number to users. So it's not the right way of doing things. The same, It mitigates the risk we are trying to build in our data set. So this is one of the most common issues, right? We all know this is how we have learned basic mathematics, that you cannot divide by zero. It's a common issues that could happen, but why do we want to invest time invest time once the issue has happened and then we are trying to figuring it out? So by using best practices, those common issues and common pitfalls, they can already be avoided in the beginning. You get into a faster problem solving. You don't have to learn by errors. You already know, okay, so we have some best practices that are defined by industry or community for a particular task. Maybe it's performance related, or it's formatting or consistency related. You don't have to learn it by yourself in the hard way. You can just directly utilize the best practices available in the market or community. And while doing that, it saves you the time and cost, because you are now wasting time trying to, let's say, optimize it or trying to find an error. So it gives you the time and cost savings that you can utilize focusing on the projects or some other things. And finally, it's about performance and efficiency. So we recently saw 4 different examples. Even though the 2 options they were giving the correct result, but when it comes to performance, they are not performing in the way that we want them to. And this is a simple example, right? Like everything is in millisecond. But when you put a divide operation in like more complex, let's say you're trying to calculate consumer price index and on everything, then you need to do division operations so many times, like as many products you have in your basket. So in this situation, the performance and efficiency matters. And using best practices ensure that you are sticking to your performance and your efficiency is to the top that you can achieve. Right? So next, let's look at what is the current situation of best practices, because they exist, right? So one thing that has happened over the years since the introduction of Power BI and then all the BI tools, the best practices has evolved. We can kind of say they are not fully mature yet, because there's new best practices coming every day. And with the new changes in technologies, new evolutions, you get new best practices every other day. So first thing that has happened is they have been codified as JSON rules. So until last 4 or 5 years ago, best practices were something that was just in the team specific, or let's say organization specific. They have the best practices and they manually go in and they manually check and they make sure that their products, like whether it's a data set or report, they are following the best practices. But now those best practices are available as JSON rule files. So they have been codified using different technologies. So let's say when it comes to semantic models or data set, we use link to codify and regular expression to check against it. We'll see, we'll take a look at it soon. And the second part, and maybe the most important part here, is that now we have open source community tools that can evaluate your semantic model and your report against the best practices. So that gives, you don't have to spend extra penny to get those tools, and they are available for free. They're designed by community and they are available for everyone to use. So if you try to use it in your day-to-day practice or day-to-day life, maybe you could face some installation challenges, that they are free tools and maybe your organization doesn't allow you to install external tools or third-party tools. So in some of those tools, one good thing that I like about them is you can install them as your own user. So when you install some software for your own user account, you don't need administration permissions. So you can install it even if your machine has a restriction on what can you install. And of course, if it doesn't work, you can always try to raise a ticket with your IT desk and try to get, because these tools will help you to evaluate your best practices. And even other community tools, there are other free tools available in the market that can improve your productivity on how you interact or develop Power BI reports, right? So let's look at the tools that we are going to use today and that are used so far. So for semantic model, we have best practice analyzer that comes within Tabulator 2. You also have Tabulator 3, and the best practices analyzer PBA is also comes pre-built in Tabulator 3 as well. But Tabulator 3 is a paid tool, but Tabulator 2 is a free tool. You can use it without any license, without any cost. But one limitation here is, so Tabulator 2 only deals with metadata of a text of your semantic model, right? So you cannot use it to check or evaluate reporting best practices. It's only used for the semantic model related best practices. For report, we have another community tool called as PBI Inspector. I personally like the logo, how they try to make it look like Sherlock Holmes here with PBI. So this is another community tool, and this tool, the PBI inspector, it only evaluates the reporting side of the Power BI solution. So it can evaluate your report against the reporting best practices. Right. Next, let's look at, I call it anatomy of a JSON rule, right? So here we just saw that now best practices has been coded as JSON rule. Let's look at how do they look like, because we're gonna discuss about them when we talk about how do you enforce them with Azure DevOps, right? So here's a sample of a rule file, best practice JSON rule file from semantic model. And we were talking about the divide function earlier. So I'm just showing you the code snippet for the divide function. So a rule has an ID and use the divide function for division, simple. It has a name, quite straightforward, use the divide function for division. It has a category, because you can have different categories. You can have DEX expression category, you can have performance, you can have efficiency. Well, basically you can create any category that you want. Then you have a description. So the user who's receiving or who's executing it, they know more about why this best practice is highlighted as broken or not being followed in your data model. Then you have a severity. You will get to this in a second. Then you have a scope, because in our data model, we have different type of objects. You have measure, calculate column, calculation item, simple tables. So in scope, we define on what kind of object does this best practice apply. So when you are executing this JSON rule, only the specified objects will be evaluated against your best practice. Then you have an expression where you write what you want to trying to check. It's just a simple regular expression. Finally, you have compatibility level. You can ignore it, but those of you who are interested, so it's something every time a new Power BI version or there's a major change in the service or the way data model is designed, the compatibility level goes up. So analysis level model have a different compatibility, Power BI has different compatibility, and so on. So important here is severity. So if you look at severity, this is like in semantic model JSON rules, we have three severities. We have one, that's a simple informational message. Then you have second, that's a warning. And third, you have an error. So when you run this best practices in the best practice analyzer and tabulator, the severity doesn't mean anything other than just showing you what is the severity level of it. It doesn't do anything explicitly. And we're going to look at this soon. But when you use it in the command line interface, so both of these tools we saw earlier, they come with command line interface. And when you execute it from command line interface, they can give you the error message or associated description here. If you define that I want all the error message or warning messages or all the information message, and that's where it comes into the picture. And we will take a look at it when we're looking at the demo later. Second, let's look at how does the report JSON rules look like. They look a bit more complicated because when it talks about the data model, things are a bit more streamlined and you have limited number of objects available. But when we look at the report, there are so many things happening, right? We're talking about the visual itself, then each visual come with a different kind of object inside the visual. Like line chart can have 2 axes. And if you talk about just a KPI card, there's no axis, there's no concept of levels or horizontal or vertical grid lines and also. So they are defined in a bit different format, but still it's a JSON. So you have a name, you have a description of the best practice, then you have a flag called disabled. If you set it to true, then the PBI inspector will evaluate it. If you set it to false, sorry, it's the other way around. If you keep disabled as true, it's not going to be evaluated. If you keep it as false, it will be evaluated. Then you have log type. So this log type is similar to the severity when it comes to dataset rules. In my personal opinion, they should have synchronized them. So they should just call it severity or log type in both the places. But they were developed by different people at different times, right? So it's their choice to choose a name. Then you just give a path. When do you want to evaluate? Just it's a recursive feature for PBIP files. We'll not talk about that. And then you have some other like what test do you want to do? And in this particular case, what we are trying to do, there are certain settings in your Power BI report that you can disable. Like we don't want to do cross highlighting. We don't want to apply the slicer selection and all. So you can check for all of them. And they are titled as disable local slow data source setting. So this best practice will check if all 5 of them are disabled, then it's okay. Otherwise, your report can be slow while it's executing in the service. Right? Important here to note is about the log type warning. So you can think it of as severity, information, warning, and error. And we will get to it when we're talking about Azure DevOps later on. So we have all of these. we have these best practices. So what is the challenges that we have currently in our teams or when we talk about Power BI development, right? One major problem is we have the best practices, we have the tools to check those best practices. But the problem is, so far we didn't have any ways to enforce them. So we can check the best practices, and I will show you how to do that just for a quick demo. But there's no way that you can enforce it. So the enforcement of a best practice eventually boils down to the discretion of developer. If developer feels like it, maybe they will check it against the best practices. Maybe they will fix the issues. If they don't, or maybe they are in a tight timeline and they don't have the time to go through all of them, so they won't. So there was no way to enforce them. Now let's quickly look at how does these two different best practices evaluation looks like against a report. So here's a sample report I got from SQL BI guys, just called Contoso. It has 3 pages, just random pages, and then it has some tables. First, let's look at how do we use tabulator to measure this report against the semantic model best practices. Right? So I have this one here, and then you just go to tools, you have best practices analyzer, and then you select which rule you want to check. So you have different options. It could be you already have something saved in your machine. You are maybe saving best practices in your model, or maybe you have it somewhere on the network location, or maybe you have it somewhere on the network, on the internet itself. So let's look at some other GitHub repositories before we look at it, right? So I'm gonna share my browser. So here I have best practices for data model, for a semantic model from Microsoft. It's found on an open GitHub repository. You can find the link later. I will text it in the chat. And similarly, you have a different set of best practices rule from tabulator guys itself. So David Oettinger, who developed this model, maybe I'm saying his name wrong. So he also has his own repository of best practices because they are fully customizable, right? You can download this JSON file from GitHub. You can make changes according to your team, your project or organization requirement, and keep it in such a location that everyone in your organization or team can use the same set. So here are the data model rules. Let's take the one from Microsoft. And I will just go to raw and take the URL from here, quite straightforward. I'm back to my tabulator. I'm gonna click add. And then you have different, you can create from scratch, you can create from local file, or you can create from URL. I will take it from URL. Here goes the Git URL, click OK. And I select it here. And these are the text best practices that we just saw in JSON. They are all available here now. And then when I click OK, the best practice analyzer is going to run this JSON file against my data model. And then I have them listed according to category. So I have performance, I have another type of performance here, then more. So they are all related to table or whether it's available to text measure, what does it apply? You can read all of them here. And also you have a type, whether it's a column or relationship. And important, you have the severity here. So you have severity 2, that's like a warning. There is no error right now, it's just informational, right? Different severity level here. And then one thing that I like about it, so this one, some of them comes with an apply fix. So if you click on apply fix, the best practice analyzer would automatically try to apply the fix, whatever is stored. And I think that's one big difference. And if you go to Microsoft repo, you get more apply fix options for a lot of best practices compared to the tabulator one. So that's how you work with tabulator best practices analyzer. Let's look at the PBI inspector one. So I have this tool. It's a quite simple tool here. First, I will select my file here. Let's just do it. I will select this. And you have different option on how do you want to see the results. I'm not going to go into the details. You can find the tool on internet and read it on their GitHub README page. I will just use temp file, run. And when it's done, I get a simple HTML file with the results. So in this case, I have only one violation of best practices, and it says reduce the number of objects within visual. And they also highlight the location. So it's on page 1, and I have 4 boxes here. So that's the 4 visual components from my report. And the first one has a problem. So it's our Sherlock who has identified this. Right? And then if you go back here, so just a quick thing is why it's saying too many objects is it's a matrix. And if you drop down to it, like if you use this hierarchical view, you will see it has months and quarters and all. That's a lot of data to be displayed, right? So it's highlighting it as it's a warning. It's not an error, but it's a warning that we should try to fix up. All right, let's get back to our presentation. Just give me a second so I can switch this one. Okay, so we talk about the challenge and we saw how does it work today? Like how can you manually make sure that your model and report are following the best practices? But as we also discussed, it's all manual. It's up to the developer whether they want to enforce it or not. There was no automatic way to enforce that. So how do we enforce best practices in our development lifecycle? Right? Is there any automatic way? So far, there wasn't an easy or prettier way, but now with introduction of Fabric and Fabric integration with DevOps pipelines, and now with GitHub pipelines, you can enforce these best practices using your GitHub repo. So whether you use Azure DevOps or GitHub, you can enforce the best practices in your development lifecycle. So to be able to do that, we have a couple of prerequisites that should meet before you deploy it into your system, or you can even try to see it. How does it work? First one, you should have definitely a Power BI Pro license. That's one of the creator license you have in Power BI. So everyone who's working in those, they should have a Pro license. Then when it comes to capacity, either you should have a Power BI Premium P or you should have an FSK, a Fabric capacity. So that's the first prerequisite. Without Pro license and one of either Premium or Fabric, you won't be able to integrate your workspaces with Azure DevOps. Second is about Azure DevOps. You should have an active Azure DevOps account. So just because you have a M365 license or you have Power BI license doesn't mean you will automatically have a DevOps account. It's about cost control, right? So your organization might have not assigned you one DevOps account because they think you don't need it. So you need an account in Azure DevOps, and the account has to be same. So it's not. It could be in some cases you have a technical user or you have another same user with administration right in one tech but not in the other, that won't work. The same account who has access to Power BI should have access to Azure DevOps. The account has to be exactly the same. It's the same object ID in Enter ID now. Then you should have access to a repository, or you should have rights to create a repository because we are going to connect our workspace with the repository. The third is you have an admin portal tenant level setting, and that is user can synchronize workspace item with their Git repository. So just because you have Fabric doesn't mean you can automatically use Git integration. Your Power BI or now Fabric admin has to allow that permission. They have to enable that flag so you can sync your workspaces and connect and sync your workspaces with Git repositories. And I think you have different settings for Azure DevOps and for GitHub, right? Let's look at development workflow. How will the development workflow look like if you enable this setup in your team or in your project? So we have two different ways of working here right now. So today we are only going to look at this one here with the dev side on the right-hand side. But let's start from the beginning. So the way it's going to work is if you're using PBIP files, the simplest one is you check out a branch from your DevOps. So whether it's Azure DevOps or GitHub, you check out the branch. You are using Power BI Desktop with PBIP files. So you have switched to PBIP files. And then you make changes in your files from Power BI Desktop and you save it to your local folder that you have copied, like that you have connected to your DevOps. Right? And then using VS Code, you commit those files to your Git repo. And once those files are committed to your DevOps, they will be synchronized as a new branch. So you need to create a new branch and they will go to a build pipeline. The build pipeline is where all the magic is happening, what we are using to enforce the best practices. Then either your team lead or somebody who's approving your pull requests, right? They will look at it. They will either automatically merge it or they will have to manually conflict resolve and merge it. And the things will be available in the main branch. If your enforcement fails, let's say you have any error level issues in your report or your data set, then your pull request will fail because your build pipeline will fail, and then you won't be able to merge the changes back to the main branch. And once your main branch is ready, whoever has the access right here, it's team lead, but it could be some of either you or some of the dedicated person or maybe all of you. You can then commit it or synchronize your final team workspaces with the latest change. In the second use case, you don't need to go by the first route. You don't use PBIP folder. And maybe you don't want to even use Power BI Desktop. You directly make changes in the workspace itself because Fabric is allowing this new functionality. Or you can also use the Power BI Desktop, but you don't use PBIP and you save it in one of the workspaces and the process repeats. So when you save it to the workspace, you cannot synchronize directly with the main branch. You create a feature branch, then you raise a pull request, the build pipeline runs, and if everything succeeds, then it goes to the main, and then the main can be synchronized with the team workspace. So there are 4 main steps that we should talk about, and I will demo it as well today. The first one is we need to connect the workspaces to Azure DevOps. Simple one, right? Second, we will create and run a DevOps pipeline. And this pipeline is where we will be using these community tools, and we will take a look at it, how it's happening. But it's DevOps pipeline is where we are enforcing the best practices. And then we will define some branch policies, because just building the pipeline, thus using the pipeline is not enough. We want people to raise pull requests. We don't want them to be able to directly push the content to the main branch, because if they do it, then we cannot enforce it. And then finally, we need to create a pull request. So by we, I mean it's the developer who's pushing the changes. They need to create a pull request, and then the team lead or the dedicated resource you have, or even you yourself, can see if the build has passed or failed, and then you can merge the changes back to the master. So to summarize, the first 3 steps is something, it's like a one-time setup. You have connected your workspace once, you have set up your DevOps pipeline with enforcement, and you have also defined branch policies. So this is a one-time job. The last one, the step 4, create pull request, that has to happen every time any team member tries to push anything to that particular branch, right, or into that particular workspace, and they want it to be available in the next workspace. So that's how we enforce that nobody can push the report or data set without going through the best practices analyzer first. Right? So let's look at the demo, and I will show you the steps and walk you through on how is it working in real life. All right. Let's minimize this, and I'll bring up my Power BI here. All right. So here I have the setup. So it's just my trial environment. So don't go on the naming. I don't follow any naming convention. All this is just for demo. So I have a dev Contoso best practices workspace here. Then I have a test Contoso best practices here. So my goal here is I want to enforce best practices whenever somebody tries to make a change to my report and they tries to push any either data set or report to my test Contoso best practice. So that's the workspace where I want the enforcement to happen. So right now I don't have any content or anything. So this sample file, right? Let me push this sample file to the dev workspace. There we go, select. And in the meantime that it's happening, we go to our DevOps here. So if you haven't seen DevOps before, go through it, just take a look around. We need to create a repo first. So either you should have a repo or you should have rights to create a repo. I'll create a new repo here. I will just call it demo Contoso. Right, my repository is ready. Let's see if my file has been published. Yes. Let's go to Power BI. And the first thing I'm going to do is I will connect my workspace, the dev workspace where I have just published my file, to my new repo that I have created. Go to workspace setting. Then I'm going to go to Git integration, Azure DevOps. The account has to be the same. So it's the same account. Choose my organization, choose my project, choose my repo, and then I will just put it in the main branch because it's my dev. Connect and sync. All right, so my dev has been connected to the new repo that I have created. Let's refresh it. Here I have files here, right? The second, that's the first step, that we have connected a workspace to our DevOps repo. Second, we will need to create a pipeline. Let's create a pipeline. I have just 2 other pipelines, ignore them. New pipeline. I want the code to be from my repo, demo Contoso. Then I will use the starter pipeline. And now, the best thing about there is, like, if you go to this analysis services Git repo, I will send the name. Maybe you will leave that if you want to try it for yourself in the chat. There we go. So a sample pipeline is already created here. So you can just copy the entire YAML code from here, copy raw file, just paste and replace, right? Let's quickly just take a look what's happening here. So just some triggers, some pool and all, not important. So here we have 2 jobs, right? First job is build datasets. It's a bit old naming convention, right? They should change it to semantic model now. It's going to happen sometime, I hope. Then each job, so I have two jobs. First is build data set. That's where we're going to check the data set best practices against the JSON rules. Then second job I have is called build reports. That's where we're gonna check our report against the best practices. Then each of these job has two tasks, and they are both PowerShell types. So we have one task here, and what it does is, because as I mentioned, right, both Tabulator and PBI Inspector, they are open source community tools, and they come with a CLI, a command line interface as well. So what this first task does, the first task goes to the GitHub repo and copies the portable or the binaries to our pipeline during execution. That's the first task. The second task is we need to download the rules, because just downloading the software or tool is not enough. We need to have the rules. So in the second task, oh, sorry, my bad. In the first task, we download the binaries, and then we also download the rules. So the best practices rules that we just saw, the JSON rules. In the second task, we execute these rules using the CLI against the dataset or the report. So that's what's happening here. So first we download the table editor, then we download the dataset rules. And one note here. So these ones are the default one from Microsoft Services. So instead of this, you can use the rules from Tabulator itself, or if you have your own company specific or team specific, you can also use them. If they are hosted on public internet, you can use the URL. If they are hosted in your, if you have them in local machine, then you can just upload them to the root of this build pipeline, and you can just change these two parameters here, and then you're good to go. In the second task, we download the PBI inspector right here. Sorry, in the second job. It's kind of confusing, job and task. So each job has tasks, and then your pipeline has multiple jobs. So in the build reports, the first task is to download the PBI inspector CLI file, executable, and also the rules from the same repo from PBI inspector. The second task is to execute those binaries and then evaluate your report file against the rule file that we just have. Right, so that's all a brief explanation. Most of it is just about error checking and check if you have multiple files in your repo, then it's going to execute it against each single one of them. Then we just do save and run. Initial commit, I will just leave it as it, save and run. Right, it's going to take a while, and then I have a free account, so the priority is a bit slow and the parallelism is a bit slow as well. But let's wait a few seconds. And another important thing is if you have a free account, like I have a developer account that gives me access to all these things for demo and trial purposes, then if you have never used DevOps before and you try to set it up, then your request most likely will fail. You cannot execute these two tasks. So what has happened? You need an agent to be able to execute this task. And earlier, Microsoft used to assign agents to everyone, but now it has become on a request basis. So some smart people among us, they were using these free tools or free functionality to mine bitcoins or send spam emails and all. So Microsoft have disabled the free assignment of agents. You need to request it, and it usually takes 2 to 3 business days, and your request gets approved. All right. So our pipeline has run, and here you can see all the warnings. So we have 67 warnings. And then if you click on a single one, you can see, so first you can see all the tasks that has happened. First we initialize the job, download it, run data set, post job and all. So if I click on this, you will see all the evaluation result that I have. So these are all warnings, right? And I can see all what has happened. These are exactly the same what we saw earlier when we manually run it in our desktop. Same if you go to report rules, you have one, reduce the number of objects, because it's exactly the same setup that we did manually earlier. So that's how you can look at the detailed result if you are interested to see. So right now, that's just one. The second step is done. We have enforced it by using it, like we have made sure that whenever pipeline runs, we are evaluating it against the best practices. The second part is we want to enforce it that nobody can directly commit to the main branch. And to be able to do that, we will go to the branches in our repo, hits the main branch, and I will set up branch policies. And by setting up branch policies, I'm making sure that nobody can directly push things to my main branch without raising a pull request. And it's quite simple. You just go here, you add a build validation here, and I will select my pipeline, demo Contoso. a bunch of options that you can see. Policy requirement has to be set yes, right? So the build must succeed. So if it fails for any reason, and in this case, it's gonna be if you have a severity 3 or an error level best practices violation in your reported data set, only then your build will fail. Click on just save. All right, so this is done. Now, second part. So this has been done in my dev. Now, my goal was to get it to the test in the end, right? The test should always have the validated or the best practices confirmed code. So what I will do, I will first quickly connect my test also with my same repository that I have. DevOps connect. Takes a couple of seconds. All right, so my test is set up, and then I have the latest code, latest change from my Azure DevOps, via Azure DevOps from my dev to my test. Now let's go to Power BI Desktop, and I will try to show you how does this enforcement works, right? Now I have done some homework, so I know. So one case where you can get an error instead of warning is if you have a DEX measure without any definition, you just have a DEX measure with a name. And this is one of a very common problem, right? A lot of time we create new measure and then we forget to input anything. It doesn't have a code and it just goes to the production or test environment or whatever. Let's see, I will just rename it measure 2 equal. There's no definition there. So that's the violation, severity 3 violation. I know because I've been through the JSON file earlier. And then for the visual part, so these are my theme colors. And a lot of times we want to enforce themes, right? Our organization have a theme and we want users to respect those rules. We don't want you to select a random color. So let's try to set a random color here. I will just go to this on purpose. Let's look at, I have a favorite color. I'm going to set that one up instead here. All right, now it looks green. Now let's just publish it to my dev. Contours of best practices. Done. All right, so let's come back to my dev workspace here. All right, the changes are here, and I get a pop-up that they are not synchronized with my GitHub, my DevOps yet. Right, source control. Let's try to commit it. Say just updates, and I'm connected to the main. And when I try to commit it, I'm not allowed to commit because I have set up branch policies. So if somebody tries to do that, it's not allowed. You can't directly commit to the main. You have to raise a pull request. Now, to be able to do that, what I will do, instead of main, I will check this out as a new branch. I will just call it as feature and just call it updates. Right? Check out branch. Then when I try to commit it now, because now you can check, I'm in the new branch that I committed. I checked out earlier. We'll just call it updates, commit. All right, my changes have been synced. And if I go to repo here, let's see. Okay, so I have a new branch here, right? Branches. I have a new branches here called feature updates, and I get a message that I need to create a pull request. So let's create a pull request. I will just leave it default for now, just create. So what is going to happen now? So the steps that we just saw an overview, they are going to run now. So it's gonna take all the 2 jobs. It's gonna download the tabulator binaries, run it against the best practices rules. It's going to download the PBI inspector binaries and run it against the rules. And then we get a result of what has happened. Refresh it. Right, still building. It's going to take a few seconds. It's also because I have just a free demo account, right? So it's a bit slow. I don't have the priority to execute all my tasks. All right, it's completed. Let's check. It has failed. I have one required check failed. Then let's look at the results here. What do you have? So both of the jobs has failed, both build data set and build reports. And here you have the errors. The first one is violates rule error prevention. Expression reliant object must have an expression because our measure was missing an expression. That's one. Second, there's no formatting set for it because I didn't set any. So this is another one that fails. It causes an error. And the third one, I'm not using the theme color. I'm using a different color altogether. So these are the three reasons my job has failed, and I cannot commit my changes back to my main branch. Now, to fix that, now with that, first thing you have enforce, then your developer must now go back to Power BI, look through all the results and fix it. Let's try to do it right now, quick. So I will just rename it. I don't want to rename it visual change. I will just call it rows. Just a simple example, right? So I have fixed my DEX expression here. And then I will change the color back to my blue, the default, my theme color. And I will publish it back to my dev. And in the meantime, so let's talk about the possibility. What if somebody tries to directly commit to the test workspace, but it can happen, right? That, okay, I'm not going to commit it to the dev, but I would rather commit it directly to the test. So you can publish it to the test, but once you go to the test or once you go to your workspace again, you will have to commit the changes back to your DevOps. And then if you try to do that directly to your main, you will get the same error again because we are not, by enforcing branch policies, we are making sure nobody can directly publish or commit any changes to the main branch. It has to come through a pull request. All right, so here I go. Just gonna change fixed errors, commit it again. So these are after the changes I just made. Right, this is done. I'll get back here. I don't need to raise another pull request. I already have a pull request. So smart enough to just re-execute the same things over again. In the meantime, if anyone has any questions, just feel free to type in and I'll try to take them up after our session. We are almost at the end. Okay, still running. Okay, it's gonna take a few minutes, but in the meantime, I can also show let's talk about if you want to customize these best practices for you. Let's say we saw there was some 67 warnings. And if you come from a software background field, right? So whenever we used to compile things, we don't care about warnings. We only care about errors. But you want to make sure that some of those warnings, you want to highlight them as an error, then the only thing you need to do is change the severity from 2 to 3. So from a warning to an error, and the DevOps will do the job for you. So the check has been succeeded. The build has succeeded because I have taken care of those 2 errors. Then I will just set on complete. And there are a few things that I can talk, like what do you want to do when you merge? DevOps will merge automatically. I don't want to keep my featured branch. It's of no use to me right now. Or if you want it for logging and auditing purposes, you can untick this one. I will just do it complete merge. And now the pull request will take place. And then because it's already verified, now let's go to the branches. My feature branch has disappeared and I'm back to my main. That's in DevOps. Now, if I go to my test workspace here, I can see that they have been merged, and then I have a message that your source, your workspace is behind your source. And then I can just update it now. And when I update it, the workspace syncs all the content from my DevOps to my test workspace. And that was a simple demo. So let's get back to our presentation. I have a few more things to talk about. Right, and then we are almost at the end. Let's talk about some benefits and limitation, right? So what we just saw, it looks fantastic, right? It's you don't have to manually do it. And if you have new team members joining in, you can be rest assured that they have to follow best practices. They cannot just commit changes or push changes to your main files and break your test or production workspaces. So some few benefits and limitations. So starting with the benefits, so you can guarantee that whatever is happening in your workspace, they have the best practices evaluated. And you can also change whether you want to even enforce the one with labeled as warnings. And then you can just change it to error, and then DevOps will enforce them as well. Then another advanced thing is that we didn't cover in today's session. Other than these best practices with this DevOps pipeline, you can also build advanced quality tests by using Python, because now you have much more flexibility. So one simple example is, let's say we want our developers to directly take data from a file, or let's say from a database. We don't want them to write SQL in the Power Query itself to source the data. We want them to just connect to the database and take the table or the view, but do not write a SQL. So we cannot do that with best practices, but we can do that with the help of Python. And now you can write a Python script and execute it in your DevOps pipeline. Then next one is quite obvious, increased team efficiency. So you are more faster, you are not dealing with common problems. You are avoiding those known issues and pitfall in the first place. It's independent of development method, whether you like to use PBIP or you like to do what I just showed. You do things in Power BI desktop, you commit it to one workspace, and then you use DevOps to enforce best practice or move to another one. If you want to use Tabulator, you can also do that because you're committing to one workspace. So it works, it's independent of whatever tool or local setup you are using to make changes in data model or report. And the next one is a bit unclear to me. So what I see is maybe you need an extra license for DevOps, and that's why there's a tiny star up there. You don't need any new features or new pro license from Power BI as long as you have a premium and pro license. The requirement we talk about, you might need a DevOps license. So just talk to your admin and make this clear to you. And the last one, the best one that I like, you can customize the best practices according to your need. So if you have a specific team or project related requirement, you can just code them as a JSON. And the thing that I like about that also, you can just post it on the GitHub that is set up by Tabulator, and somebody from the community, they will reply to your requirement. Maybe somebody has already made it into a JSON rule. If not, then people are very active and they reply to your request quite fast. The next few limitations. So right now, this Git integration with Fabric that we just saw, it's in preview, right? So do not use it for production systems right now. It's good to figure it out. And then another thing is, we are talking about it because it's the future. This is where we are headed. This is where Microsoft is investing, and that's what's going to happen. So it's not fully ready to be used in production right now, but you can play around it with and talk to your teams or your leads and see how can you set it up going forward in the future. And the last one, another limitation is there are some best practices, like if you want to check if you have any many-to-many relationship in your data model. So to be able to do that, even right now manually, first you need to run Vertipack Analyzer. So it's a free tool from SQL BI. You can run it. It collects the store. It collects the statistics about your model, and then you can run best practices on top of that. And that cannot happen right now in Vertipack Analyzer because you need to make some annotation and all. Right. So next we are at questions, and I see we have some questions. Let me quickly go through them. Okay, so we have some from Fahmi Abdul. Will this approach work with GitHub integration as well? Yes, it will. So they recently announced, by they I mean Microsoft recently announced the GitHub integration as well with Fabric workspaces. So I assume it will work. I haven't done it. So there might be some hurdles or different ways of doing things, but it will work. That's the end goal of Microsoft. And then you have from Vijwani, you use one build and release pipeline for each workspace. it's not about each workspace. It's about each project or each Power BI solution you have, right? So I connected my one repository to my dev and test, and if you want to have production as well. So you connect one, and then it's about branching and merging functionalities. So you can connect it to as many uh, workspaces as possible. But in this demo, I only use one pipeline because my only goal is to build and show you how does it work. And another thing is, if you want to do multiple checks, you can build them all in one pipeline. And then I think there is a functionality you can build multiple pipelines to execute things in sequence if that's a requirement. But like the functionality you get from pipelines, you can define multiple jobs and multiple tasks. So you can achieve all the test and automation in just one pipeline itself. You don't need multiple pipelines for that. All right, great questions. Thank you. So next, I will just leave you with two key takeaways from this session. Is by using best practices, you can avoid common pitfalls. If you are not doing it yet, get started doing it. The tools are free, and even if you don't have access to DevOps or you don't have Fabric license on Power BI, or your admin have disabled it, or you need to fight a long battle to get them enabled, at least start doing it manually. You have the free tools who facilitate using to doing that, right? The next one is quite simple. Like you have an automation tool available that you can use Azure DevOps to enforce best practices. That wasn't available so far, but now we are getting there. I see a comment from Barry. Interesting. Thank you, Benny. That's amazing. All right. So with that, we are at the end of our session. But before we go, I would ask a second of your time. I would like to have some feedback on what did you think about this session. So if you have a phone, just scan the QR code with your phone. And I will also type in the link if you are on a machine and you want to directly access this. It's a Microsoft form. And just to clarify, it's completely anonymous. We are not collecting any personal data. So your feedback remains anonymous, but it helps me to improve my session and get to know if I should change anything in future sessions or how can I improve myself. With that, I thank you all. Thank you so much. And I will make a blog about it soon on my blog, bits.bi.com. So if you are interested, just keep it in your bookmarks for now, or you will get or if you subscribe, you get a notification in a few days.